Get ready to witness one of the most shocking revenge stories you'll ever hear. This is about Emma Rodriguez, a new girl who walked into the wrong locker room at the wrong time. But what she did next will leave you absolutely speechless. When 3 popular girls tried to humiliate her in the most twisted way possible, they had no idea they were messing with someone who would turn their entire world upside down. This isn't just about getting even. This is about a quiet girl who unleashed a storm that changed everything at Westfield High forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Emma Rodriguez pressed her back against the cold metal of Locker 247, clutching her gym bag like a shield against her chest. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the Westfield High girls' locker room. 6 weeks into her junior year, and she still felt like an outsider. Looking in, the familiar scent of cheap deodorant and that industrial soap they used to clean the floors made her stomach turn. She'd transferred here from Phoenix after her parents' messy divorce, and her mom Maria had picked Millbrook, Texas because it was affordable and far from the drama they'd left behind. What they hadn't counted on was finding new drama waiting. For them, the locker room was mostly empty now, just a few stragglers from the previous period changing out of their pay uniforms. Emma had learned to time her arrivals carefully, slipping in when most girls were already gone to avoid the stares, and whispered comments about the new girl with the secondhand clothes and the thick Arizona accent. She fumbled with her combination lock, her fingers trembling slightly. The numbers felt foreign under her touch, just like everything else in this place. Through the small window near the ceiling, she could see the Texas sun beating down on the football field where the boys were running drills, their shouts echoing across the campus. Emma had always been good at making herself invisible. In Phoenix, she'd perfected the art of blending into crowds, of speaking just quietly enough that teachers had to lean in to hear her, of choosing seats in the back corner where she could observe without being observed. But invisibility was harder to achieve when you were the only new face in a school where everyone had known each other since kindergarten. Her dark hair was longer now than it had been in Arizona, falling past her shoulders like a curtain she could hide behind. She wore it down every day, even though the Texas heat made her neck sticky with sweat. The sound of approaching voices made her freeze. She recognized the cadence immediately, Ashley Parker's laugh, sharp and bright like breaking glass. Emma's heart began to race as she heard the distinctive click of expensive sneakers against the tile floor. Ashley was Westfield High royalty, the kind of girl who seemed to glide rather than walk, whose blonde hair caught the light just right, whose smile could launch 1,000 likes on Instagram. She was flanked, as always, by her 2 closest allies, Brittany Walsh and Jessica Cole. The 3 of them moved through the school like they owned it, and in many ways, they did. Emma tried to shrink further into the corner, hoping they wouldn't notice her. She'd managed to avoid any direct confrontation with Ashley's crew for 6 weeks by perfecting the art of strategic invisibility. She knew their schedules, their patterns, their favorite hangout spots. She'd memorized which bathroom stalls they preferred, which vending machines they frequented, even which routes they took between classes. It was exhausting, this constant vigilance, but it had kept her safe. Until now. Ashley's voice carried across the locker room, honey-sweet but with an edge that made Emma's skin crawl. Well, well, well. Look what we have here. The clicking footsteps stopped directly behind Emma, and she could feel 3 pairs of eyes boring into her back. She turned slowly, her gym bag still clutched against her chest like armor. Ashley stood there in her perfectly coordinated workout outfit, the kind that cost more than Emma's mom made in a week at Murphy's Diner. Her smile was predatory, all white teeth and cold blue eyes. Brittany flanked Ashley's left side, her red hair pulled back in a high ponytail that swished when she moved. She was shorter than Ashley but somehow more intimidating, with sharp features and a way of looking at people like they were insects under a microscope. Jessica completed the triangle on Ashley's right, tall and athletic, with the kind of casual confidence that came from never having to worry about anything more serious than which filter to use on her latest selfie. Emma, right? Ashley's voice was syrupy, false concern dripping from every syllable. We haven't had a chance to properly welcome you to Westfield. She stepped closer, and Emma caught a whiff of expensive perfume mixed with mint gum. I heard you're from Arizona. That must be such a big change, coming from the desert to our little Texas town. Emma nodded, not trusting her voice. She'd learned early that responding to Ashley's group often made things worse. They fed on reactions, on signs of weakness or fear. But staying silent seemed to irritate them just as much. It was a no-win situation, and Emma felt trapped between the lockers and these three girls who seemed to take up all the oxygen in the room. Brittany stepped forward, her green eyes gleaming with something that might have been amusement if it hadn't been so cruel. You know, Emma, we've been talking about you. About how you always seem to be hiding, skulking around like you're afraid of your own shadow. She tilted her head, studying Emma like she was a puzzle to be solved. It's kind of sad, really. A girl your age should have friends, should be social. Instead, you eat lunch alone and practically run away whenever anyone tries to talk to you. Jessica nodded in agreement, her voice softer but no less cutting. We feel bad for you, honestly. It can't be easy being the weird new girl with no friends and clothes that look like they came from a thrift store. She gestured at Emma's outfit, a simple t-shirt and jeans that had seen better days. I mean, we get it. Single mom struggling to make ends meet. It's probably really hard. The mention of her mother made Emma's jaw clench. Maria worked herself to the bone, pulling double shifts at the diner and picking up weekend cleaning jobs just to keep them afloat. She came home every night exhausted, her feet aching and her uniform stained with coffee and grease, but she never complained. She'd sacrificed everything to give Emma a fresh start, and hearing these privileged girls mock that sacrifice made anger bubble up in Emma's chest. Ashley must have noticed the change in Emma's expression because her smile widened. Oh, did we hit a nerve? We're just trying to help, Emma. You see, we have a reputation to maintain at this school. We're leaders, trendsetters, and having someone like you walking around looking so. She paused, searching for the right word. Tragic, well, it reflects poorly on all of us. The locker room felt smaller now, like the walls were closing in. Emma glanced toward the exit, but Jessica had positioned herself to block that route. They had her cornered, and they knew it. The fluorescent lights seemed brighter now, harsh and unforgiving, casting deep shadows under their eyes and making their smiles look more like grimaces. Brittany reached out and touched Emma's gym bag, her fingers brushing against Emma's arms. You know what I think your problem is? You're too covered up, too hidden. Maybe if people could actually see you, really see you, you'd make some friends. Her voice was conversational, almost friendly, but there was something darker lurking beneath the surface. Emma pulled her bag closer to her chest, alarm bells going off in her head. I should get to class, she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't want to be late. Ashley laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a storm. Oh, sweetie, class doesn't start for another 10 minutes. We have plenty of time to help you with your little confidence problem. She nodded at Brittany and Jessica, some silent communication passing between them. You know what we think would help? If you showed a little more personality, stopped hiding behind all those layers of clothes, and actually let people see the real Emma. The suggestion hung in the air like a threat. Emma's heart was pounding so hard she was sure they could hear it. She pressed herself back against the lockers, the cold metal biting through her shirt. The room suddenly felt too warm, too close, like the air was being sucked out through the vents. Jessica moved closer, her tall frame casting a shadow over Emma. "Come on, don't be shy, we're all girls here. There's nothing to be embarrassed about." Her voice was gentle, coaxing, but her eyes were hard as flint. "Just slip out of that ratty old shirt. Let's see what you're hiding under there." Emma's breath caught in her throat. She looked from one face to another, searching for any sign that this was some kind of joke, that they would laugh and walk away and leave her alone. But their expressions were deadly serious, expectant. They were actually serious about this, actually planning to humiliate her in the most degrading way possible. "No," Emma said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I'm not doing that. Leave me alone." Ashley's expression darkened, her mask of false friendliness slipping for just a moment. "Excuse me? Did you just tell us no?" She stepped closer, invading Emma's personal space until Emma could feel her breath on her face. "I don't think you understand how things work here, Arizona. We're trying to help you, and you're being incredibly rude." Brittany nodded enthusiastically. "Super rude and ungrateful. Do you know how many girls would kill for our attention, for us to take an interest in helping them fit in?" She crossed her arms over her chest, her expression shifting from predatory to offended. "We're popular, Emma. We matter here. And if we say you need to come out of your shell, then that's what's going to happen." Emma tried to sidestep toward the exit, but Jessica moved to block her path again. The girl was fast, athletic from years of volleyball and track. Emma was trapped, surrounded by three girls who seemed to grow more confident with every passing second. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The locker room felt like a cage now, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like angry insects. "Please," Emma said, hating how small her voice sounded. "I just want to go to class. I haven't done anything to you." Ashley's laugh was cold and sharp. "Haven't done anything? Emma, your entire existence is doing something to us. Walking around here like some tragic little victim, making the whole school feel sorry for the poor new girl. It's pathetic, and it's dragging down the whole vibe of this place." She gestured grandly at the locker room around them. "We have standards here, expectations, and you're not meeting them." The three girls moved in closer, forming a tight circle around Emma. She could smell their different perfumes mixing together, creating a cloying cloud that made her feel dizzy. Brittany reached out again, this time grabbing the hem of Emma's t-shirt. "Come on, just lift it up a little. We're not asking for much." Emma jerked away, her back hitting the lockers with a metallic clang that echoed through the room. "Don't touch me." The words came out louder than she'd intended, filled with a desperation that seemed to energize her tormentors rather than deter them. Jessica grabbed Emma's wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. "Stop being such a baby about this. It's not like we're asking you to run naked through the hallways. Just show us what you're working with under there. Maybe we can give you some tips on how to dress better, how to actually look like you belong here." Emma tried to pull free, but Jessica's grip tightened. Panic was setting in now, real and immediate. These girls weren't going to stop, weren't going to get bored and walk away. They were going to follow through on their threat, and there was nothing she could do to stop them. The locker room suddenly felt like a different world, separated from the rest of the school by invisible walls. No one was coming to help her. No one even knew she was here. Ashley reached for the bottom of Emma's shirt, her manicured fingers brushing against Emma's skin. "Hold her still," she commanded Brittany and Jessica, her voice taking on a harder edge. "If she won't cooperate, we'll just have to help her overcome her shyness." Emma's world narrowed to this moment, this violation of everything she thought she knew about safety and boundaries. These weren't cartoon villains or movie bullies who would be defeated by a witty comeback or a moment of courage. These were real girls with real power in this small Texas town. Girls who believed they could do whatever they wanted because they'd never faced any real consequences for their actions. But as Ashley's fingers began to tug at her shirt, as Brittany and Jessica tightened their grip on her arms, something shifted inside Emma Rodriguez. Something that had been building for 6 weeks of hiding, 6 weeks of strategic invisibility, 6 weeks of watching these girls treat the hallways of Westfield High like their personal kingdom. The fear was still there, sharp and immediate. But underneath it was something else. Something that burned hot and bright and promised that this moment, this humiliation, would not be the end of her story. It would be the beginning of theirs. The grip on Emma's arms tightened as Ashley's fingers found purchase on the fabric of her shirt. Emma could feel the cotton stretching, threatening to tear under the pressure. Her mind raced, searching for an escape route that didn't exist. The locker room felt like it was spinning around her, the fluorescent lights creating a strobe effect that made everything feel surreal and nightmarish. She could hear her own breathing, rapid and shallow, mixing with the excited whispers of her tormentors. Brittany's nails dug into Emma's left arm, leaving small crescent-shaped marks on her skin. Her grip was surprisingly strong for someone so petite, and Emma realized that this wasn't the first time these girls had done something like this. There was a practiced efficiency to their movements, a coordination that spoke of previous victims, who had never spoken up, never reported what had happened to them in this very room. Jessica's volleyball-trained muscles held Emma's right arm immobile, and Emma could smell the girl's expensive shampoo mixed with the metallic scent of fear-induced sweat. Her own sweat, Emma realized with a start. Her body was betraying her, responding to the situation with a fight-or-flight response that had nowhere to go. She was trapped between the lockers and these 3 girls who seemed to feed off her terror. Ashley's blue eyes gleamed with something that went beyond mere bullying. This was about power, about asserting dominance in the most primal way possible. Her perfectly manicured fingers continued to work at Emma's shirt, and Emma could feel the fabric beginning to ride up, exposing her midriff to the harsh fluorescent lighting. The vulnerability was overwhelming, not just physical but emotional. These girls were stripping away more than just clothing. They were tearing apart the careful walls Emma had built around herself. The door to the locker room seemed impossibly far away, though it was only 20 feet. 20 feet might as well have been 20 miles when you were being held by 3 girls who had clearly done this before. Emma wondered how many other victims there had been, how many other quiet girls had endured this humiliation and then kept silent about it afterward. The thought made her stomach churn with a mixture of nausea and rage. Emma tried to speak, to plead with them one more time, but the words wouldn't come. Her throat felt constricted, like someone was squeezing it from the outside. She could only make small, desperate sounds that seemed to encourage her attackers rather than deter them. Ashley's smile widened at Emma's obvious distress, and she tugged harder at the shirt, exposing more skin to the cold air of the locker room. The metal lockers pressed against Emma's back were cold enough to make her gasp. The contrast between the chill of the metal and the heat of her own panic, creating a sensory overload that made it hard to think clearly. She could feel individual rivets and scratches in the painted surface through her shirt, each imperfection digging into her skin as she was pressed harder against the wall. Brittany leaned in closer, her breath hot against Emma's ear. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but each word was clear and deliberate. "You know, Emma, this could have been so much easier if you'd just been friendly from the beginning. If you'd made an effort to fit in instead of skulking around like some kind of ghost." Her fingers traced along Emma's arm, a mockery of gentleness. That made Emma's skin crawl, but you chose to be difficult. You chose to make us work for this. Jessica nodded in agreement, her grip never loosening. "We actually felt sorry for you at first. New girl, no friends, obviously struggling financially. We thought about being nice, about taking you under our wing." Her voice carried a note of fake regret that was somehow more chilling than outright cruelty. "But you made it clear you didn't want our help. You ignored us in the hallways, avoided eye contact, Acted like you were too good for us. Emma wanted to scream that it wasn't like that, that she'd been afraid of them from day one, that their reputation for cruelty preceded them through every conversation she'd overheard in the cafeteria and every warning look she'd received from other students. But her voice remained trapped somewhere deep in her chest, buried under layers of terror and disbelief. Ashley's fingers found the hem of Emma's shirt and began to pull upward with more force. The fabric stretched and strained, and Emma could hear tiny fibers beginning to snap under the pressure. The thing is, Emma, this school has a hierarchy. There are people who matter and people who don't. People who set the tone and people who follow along. Her voice was conversational, almost friendly, as if she were explaining the rules of a game rather than committing an assault. You seemed confused about where you fit in that hierarchy, so we're helping to clarify things for you. The shirt rode up further, exposing Emma's stomach to the harsh lights above. She could feel goosebumps rising on her skin, whether from the cold air or from pure terror, she couldn't tell. The vulnerability was crushing, not just the physical exposure, but the complete powerlessness of her situation. These girls held all the cards, all the social capital, all the connections that mattered in this small Texas town. Emma's mind flashed to her mother, probably at Murphy's Diner right now, refilling coffee cups and forcing smiles for customers who barely saw her as human. Maria had worked so hard to give them this fresh start, had sacrificed everything to move them away from the chaos of Phoenix. What would she think if she knew her daughter was being humiliated like this? What would she do if she found out that her efforts to protect Emma had only led to a different kind of danger? The thought of her mother gave Emma a small spark of defiance. Maria Rodriguez hadn't raised a daughter who would go down without a fight. She'd taught Emma to be strong, to stand up for herself, to never let anyone make her feel small. But knowing what you should do and being able to do it were two very different things when you were outnumbered and overpowered by people who clearly had no moral boundaries. Brittany's grip shifted, and Emma felt a brief moment of hope that she might be able to break free. But instead of loosening, Brittany's hand moved to Emma's shoulder, holding her more securely against the lockers. "You know what I think?" Brittany mused, her tone almost philosophical. "I think Emma here has been playing the victim for so long that she's forgotten how to be anything else. Maybe this will help her remember that she's not special, that she's not entitled to skulk around our school like some kind of wounded animal." Jessica laughed, a sound that would have been pleasant in any other context, but here felt like nails on a chalkboard. Oh, she's definitely been playing the victim. Walking around with that tragic expression, making everyone feel guilty for not reaching out to the poor new girl. Her voice took on a mocking tone. "But the truth is, Emma, you never wanted friends. You wanted attention. You wanted people to feel sorry for you." The accusation hit Emma like a physical blow. It wasn't true, none of it was true, but hearing it spoken aloud in such confident tones made her doubt herself for a moment. Had she been seeking attention? Had her attempts to stay invisible actually been a form of manipulation? The question swirled in her mind, adding another layer of confusion to an already overwhelming situation. Ashley seemed to sense Emma's internal struggle and pressed her advantage. "See? You know we're right. You've been playing games since day one, and now you're upset that we're not playing along." Her fingers worked at the shirt more aggressively, now pulling it up despite Emma's attempts to hold it down. "But games are over now, Emma. Time for some brutal honesty." The shirt was now bunched up around Emma's chest, exposing her plain white bra to the harsh fluorescent lighting. The humiliation was complete and absolute, but somehow the worst part wasn't the physical exposure. It was the knowledge that these girls felt entitled to do this to her, that they saw her as so far beneath them that they could violate her dignity without a second thought. Emma could feel tears building behind her eyes, but she fought them back with everything she had. Crying would only give them more satisfaction, more proof that they had broken her completely. She bit down on her lower lip hard enough to taste blood, using the pain to focus her mind and keep the tears at bay. The locker room door remained closed, sealing them off from the rest of the world. Emma wondered if anyone would come looking for her, if anyone had noticed she was missing from her next class. But even if someone did come, what were the chances they would intervene? Ashley, Brittany, and Jessica were popular, connected, beloved by teachers and administrators. Who would believe the new girl's word against theirs? Ashley stepped back to admire her handiwork, her head tilted like an artist examining a painting. There we go. That's much better. Now people can actually see you instead of just seeing this shapeless blob of fabric. Her tone was satisfied, pleased with the results of her work. You should thank us, really. We're helping you learn how to present yourself properly. Brittany released her grip on Emma's arm, but only to reach for her phone. The device appeared. In her hand like magic, its camera lens pointed directly at Emma's exposed torso. This is definitely worth documenting. Emma's big debut at Westfield High. Her finger hovered over the screen, ready to capture the moment of ultimate humiliation. The sight of the phone sent a new wave of panic through Emma's system. Being humiliated in person was one thing, but having photographic evidence that could be shared, posted, spread throughout the school and beyond was another level of violation entirely. She found her voice at last, a desperate croak that barely sounded human. "Please don't," she managed to whisper, her throat raw from fear and the effort of holding back tears. "Please, I'll do whatever you want, just don't take pictures." Jessica laughed and pulled out her own phone, joining Brittany in documenting Emma's degradation. Oh, now she wants to negotiate? Where was this cooperative attitude 5 minutes ago when we were trying to be nice? She held up her phone, adjusting the angle to get the best shot. "Besides, Emma, you look great. This is definitely your best. Look so far." Ashley moved closer again, her own phone now in hand. 3 cameras pointed at Emma's half-naked form, 3 witnesses to her complete powerlessness. "Smile, Emma. This is your moment to shine. Your chance to finally be seen by the whole school." Her voice was sing-song, mockingly cheerful. "Everyone's going to know exactly who you are now." Emma closed her eyes, unable to bear looking at the phones that would soon broadcast her humiliation to the entire student body. She could already imagine the photos being shared in group chats, posted on social media, forwarded to people she'd never even met. Her fresh start in Millbrook was over before it had really begun. But as the camera flashes began to fire, something unexpected happened. The locker room door burst open with a bang that echoed off the tiled walls like a gunshot. Mrs. Henderson, the 60-year-old pay teacher with a voice like a foghorn and a no-nonsense attitude that had intimidated students for 3 decades, stood in the doorway with her hands on her hips. Mrs. Henderson's eyes took in the scene immediately, her expression shifting from routine annoyance to genuine shock to blazing fury in the span of about 2 seconds. Her voice, when she spoke, was low and dangerous. The kind of tone that suggested violence was a very real possibility. "What in the hell is going on in here?" Ashley, Brittany, and Jessica froze like deer in headlights, their phones still raised, but no longer taking pictures. For the first time since Emma had known them, they looked genuinely afraid. Mrs. Henderson wasn't some pushover substitute teacher or young instructor trying to be cool. She was old school, the kind of educator who still believed in consequences and wasn't afraid to enforce them. Emma yanked her shirt down, covering herself as quickly as possible. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely manage the simple task, but the relief of being clothed again was overwhelming. Mrs. Henderson's presence had shifted the entire dynamic of the room, turning the predators into prey in the span of a heartbeat. Mrs. Henderson stepped into the locker room, her athletic shoes squeaking against the tile floor. Her eyes moved from Ashley to Brittany to Jessica, studying each face with the intensity of a prosecutor examining evidence. "I asked you girls a question. What are you doing to this student?" Ashley was the first to recover, her mask of innocence sliding back into place with practiced ease. "We were just talking, Mrs. Henderson. Emma was having some trouble with her shirt, and we were trying to help her." Her voice was steady, confident, the voice of someone who had talked her way out of trouble many times before. Mrs. Henderson's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes suggested she wasn't buying the explanation for even a second. "Is that so? And that's why you all had your phones out? To help with her shirt?" Her voice dripped with sarcasm thick enough to cut with a knife. Brittany stepped forward, her own innocent act kicking into high gear. "We thought she might want us to take a picture of her new look. You know how girls are about documenting outfits and stuff." She gestured vaguely at Emma, as if the explanation made perfect sense. Emma stood there in silence, her shirt now properly positioned, but her dignity still in tatters. Mrs. Henderson looked at her expectantly, clearly waiting for her version of events. But Emma found herself unable to speak, partly from lingering shock and partly from a deep-seated fear that even now, even with an adult present, these girls would find a way to make her pay for telling the truth. Mrs. Henderson seemed to understand Emma's hesitation. She'd been teaching long enough to recognize the signs of bullying, and she'd seen enough scared students to know when someone was too frightened to speak up for themselves. Her voice softened slightly when she addressed Emma directly. "Miss Rodriguez, are you all right? Do you need me to call the nurse?" Emma shook her head quickly, not trusting her voice. She just wanted this to be over, wanted to disappear from this locker room and never see Ashley, Brittany, or Jessica again. But Mrs. Henderson wasn't the type to let things slide, and Emma could see the wheels turning in the older woman's mind. Mrs. Henderson turned back to the three popular girls, her expression hardening again. "Here's what's going to happen. You three are going to delete whatever photos you just took, and you're going to do it right now in front of me." Her voice brooked no argument, carried the authority of someone who had dealt with teenage nonsense for longer than these girls had been alive. Ashley started to protest, her voice taking on a wheedling tone. "Mrs. Henderson, we really didn't take any inappropriate photos. We were just delete them. Now." Mrs. Henderson's voice cut through Ashley's explanation like a blade. "And then you're going to march yourselves down to Principal Morrison's office and wait for me there. We're going to have a very long conversation about what constitutes appropriate behavior in my school." The three girls exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them. Emma could see them calculating, trying to figure out if they could salvage the situation or if they needed to cut their losses. Finally, reluctantly, they began deleting photos from their phones, the soft beeping sound seeming unnaturally loud in the suddenly quiet locker room. Mrs. Henderson watched each deletion personally, making sure nothing was left behind. When she was satisfied, she pointed toward the door with one thick finger. "Office now. And if I find out you've shared any images of Miss Rodriguez with anyone, there will be consequences beyond your wildest nightmares." Ashley, Brittany, and Jessica filed out of the locker room like prisoners being led to execution. But as Ashley passed by Emma, she leaned in just close enough to whisper something that Mrs. Henderson couldn't hear. "This isn't over." The words sent a chill down Emma's spine, but they also kindled something else. A spark of anger that had been buried under layers of fear and humiliation. These girls thought they could threaten her, intimidate her, make her cower in corners for the rest of her high school career. They had no idea what they had just awakened in the quiet girl from Arizona. Mrs. Henderson waited until the three girls were gone before turning her full attention to Emma. Her expression was kind but serious, the look of someone who had seen too much teenage cruelty over the years. "Are you sure you're okay, honey? Do you want to talk about what really happened here?" Emma looked into Mrs. Henderson's concerned eyes and felt the walls she'd built around herself begin to crack. For 6 weeks, she'd been carrying the weight of her isolation alone, pretending that the whispers and stares and deliberate exclusion didn't bother her. But this incident had shattered something inside her, broken through her carefully maintained composure. They were trying to... Emma's voice cracked, and she had to swallow hard before continuing. They wanted to take pictures of me without my shirt. They said I needed to stop hiding, that they were going to help me fit in better. Mrs. Henderson's face darkened, and Emma could see genuine anger building in the older woman's expression. Those girls have been pushing boundaries for too long. I've had my suspicions, but this is the first time I've caught them in the act. She placed a gentle hand on Emma's shoulder. You did nothing wrong here, Emma. Nothing at all. The kindness in Mrs. Henderson's voice was almost Emma's undoing. She felt tears building again, but this time she didn't fight them. They spilled down her cheeks in hot streams, carrying with them weeks of pent-up frustration, loneliness, and fear. Mrs. Henderson didn't try to stop the tears or offer empty platitudes. She just stood there, a solid presence in the chaos of Emma's emotional storm. When the tears finally subsided, Emma wiped her face with the back of her hand and looked up at Mrs. Henderson with something approaching hope. What happens now? Mrs. Henderson's smile was grim but determined. Now we make sure this never happens to you or anyone else again. Those girls have been getting away with too much for too long, and it's time someone held them accountable. She gestured toward the door. Come on, let's go have a chat with Principal Morrison. As they walked toward the locker room exit, Emma felt something shifting inside her. The victim mentality that had defined her first 6 weeks at Westfield High was beginning to crack and crumble, replaced by something harder and more determined. Ashley Parker and her crew had made a critical error. They'd assumed that Emma would stay silent, would absorb their abuse and slink away like a wounded animal. They were about to learn just how wrong they could be. The hallway outside the locker room felt different now, less like a gauntlet to be navigated and more like a battlefield to be conquered. Emma's steps were steadier, her shoulders straighter. She was still afraid, still shaken by what had happened, but underneath the fear was something new. Something that burned bright and hot and promised that Ashley Parker's reign of terror was about to come to a very abrupt end. Principal Morrison's office was exactly what Emma had expected. Wood paneling, motivational posters, and the lingering scent of coffee and bureaucracy. Ashley, Brittany, and Jessica sat in the chairs outside his door, their earlier confidence replaced by visible anxiety. They looked up when Emma and Mrs. Henderson approached, and Emma saw something in Ashley's eyes that she'd never seen before. Fear. For the first time since arriving at Westfield High, Emma Rodriguez smiled. It wasn't a happy smile or a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who had finally found her weapon and was getting ready to use it. Ashley Parker and her friends had wanted to play games with the quiet new girl. Game on. Principal Morrison's office felt like a courtroom as Emma sat across from his imposing mahogany desk, her hands folded tightly in her lap to stop them from trembling. The walls were lined with framed diplomas and awards, testimonials to decades of educational leadership, but none of that mattered now. What mattered was the man behind the desk, his gray hair perfectly styled and his expression carefully neutral as he listened to Mrs. Henderson's account of what had transpired in the locker room. Ashley, Brittany, and Jessica had been relegated to the outer office, their whispered conversations occasionally audible through the thick wooden door. Emma could imagine them crafting their defense, coordinating their stories, preparing to paint themselves as the victims of a misunderstanding. They'd probably done this before, turned their charm and social connections into shields against any real consequences. Dr. Morrison, as he preferred to be called, was a man in his late 50s, who had built his career on maintaining order and avoiding controversy. Westfield High had a sterling reputation in the district, and that reputation translated into funding, accolades, and a comfortable position for everyone involved. Scandals were bad for business, and Emma could see in his eyes that he was already Calculating how to minimize the damage this incident might cause, Mrs. Henderson finished her account with a precision that spoke to years of dealing with administrative bureaucracy. She had witnessed the aftermath, seen the phones, observed the girl's behavior, and documented everything with the thoroughness of someone who knew that details mattered when it came to protecting students. Her voice carried the weight of genuine authority, the kind that came from 3 decades of refusing to let bullies hide behind privilege and popularity. Dr. Morrison leaned back in his leather chair, his fingers steepled as he considered the situation. Emma watched his face carefully, trying to read the thoughts behind his diplomatic expression. She'd learned to be observant during her weeks of invisibility, and right now she was seeing a man who was more concerned about protecting his school's image than protecting his students. "This is certainly a serious allegation," Dr. Morrison began, his voice measured and careful. "However, I think we need to be very cautious about jumping to conclusions. These are good girls from respected families, students who have never been in serious trouble before." His eyes shifted to Emma, and she felt the weight of his skepticism like a physical presence. "I'm not saying anything inappropriate happened, but sometimes situations can be misinterpreted, especially when emotions are running high." Mrs. Henderson's jaw tightened, and Emma could see the older woman struggling to maintain her professional composure. "Dr. Morrison, I saw those phones pointed at a half-dressed student. I witnessed the aftermath of what was clearly an attempt to humiliate and possibly document the humiliation of Miss Rodriguez. This wasn't a misunderstanding." The principal's expression remained diplomatically neutral, but Emma caught a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. Mrs. Henderson was forcing him to take a position, to choose between the comfortable path of minimizing the incident and the harder road of actually holding students accountable for their actions. Emma had seen this dynamic before, in Phoenix, when her mother had tried to get help dealing with an abusive supervisor at her previous job. The people in power always found ways to protect each other. "I appreciate your concern, Ellen, Dr. Morrison said, using Mrs. Henderson's first name in a way that felt both familiar and condescending. "But we need to consider all perspectives here. Perhaps there was a misunderstanding, a situation that got out of hand but wasn't necessarily malicious." He turned to Emma with what he probably thought was a reassuring smile. "Emma, can you tell me in your own words what happened? And please, be as objective as possible." Emma felt the familiar tightness in her throat, the same paralysis that had gripped her in the locker room. She was being asked to advocate for herself against 3 popular girls whose families probably donated generously to the school's fundraising campaigns. Her mother worked at a diner, lived in a modest apartment, had no social connections or political influence in this small Texas town. Who was going to believe her word against theirs? But as she sat there in the principal's office, Emma thought about the fear she'd seen in Ashley's eyes when Mrs. Henderson had burst into the locker room. For just a moment, the queen bee of Westfield High had looked exactly like what she was, a teenage bully who had finally been caught in the act. That moment of vulnerability gave Emma the strength to find her voice. "They cornered me in the locker room," Emma began, her voice quiet but steady. "They said I needed to stop hiding, that they were going to help me show more personality. They grabbed my arms and started pulling at my shirt, trying to expose me. When I told them to stop, they said they were going to take pictures and share them with the whole school." Dr. Morrison nodded thoughtfully, but Emma could see him already constructing alternative interpretations of her account. "And did they actually take any pictures before Mrs. Henderson arrived?" Emma hesitated, unsure of the answer. The flash of phone cameras was burned into her memory, but everything had happened so quickly, and the trauma of the moment made it difficult to separate what had actually occurred from what had felt like it was about to occur. "I think so. The phones were pointed at me, and I saw flashes, but Mrs. Henderson made them delete everything." The principal made a note on a legal pad, his handwriting careful and deliberate. "I see. And before this incident, had you had any Other negative interactions with Ashley, Brittany, or Jessica? Emma shook her head. I tried to avoid them. I'd heard they could be mean, so I just stayed out of their way. She paused, then added quietly, I guess that wasn't enough. Doctor. Morrison set down his pen and folded his hands on the desk. Emma, I want you to know that Westfield High has a zero-tolerance policy for bullying. If what you're describing actually happened, there will be consequences. However, we also have to be fair to all students involved. These girls have excellent records, strong academic performance, and significant contributions to our school community. Mrs. Henderson's voice cut through the principal's diplomatic hedging like a knife. Dr. Morrison, with all due respect, an excellent record doesn't give anyone the right to assault another student. What I witnessed was attempted sexual humiliation, and possibly the creation of compromising images of a minor. This isn't about academic performance or extracurricular activities. The word assault hung in the air like a thunderclap, and Emma saw Dr. Morrison's carefully maintained composure crack slightly. Legal terms had a way of focusing administrative attention, especially when they carried the potential for lawsuits, media attention, and district-level investigations. Emma watched as the principal's mental calculations shifted, his risk assessment becoming more complex. Let's not get ahead of ourselves, Dr. Morrison said quickly. No one is talking about assault charges or anything that dramatic. We're dealing with a situation between students that may have gotten out of hand. He looked directly at Emma, and she could see him weighing her value against the potential complications she represented. Emma, I'm going to have a conversation with Ashley, Brittany, and Jessica about appropriate behavior and boundaries. I'm sure this was just a misunderstanding that won't happen again. Emma felt something cold settle in her stomach. She was being dismissed, her trauma minimized, her experience reduced to a misunderstanding that could be solved with a stern talking to. Dr. Morrison was going to protect his star students and hope that the quiet new girl would just fade back into the background where she belonged. Mrs. Henderson leaned forward in her chair, her voice taking on a dangerous edge. Dr. Morrison, if you're planning to handle this with nothing more than a conversation, I think you should know that I'm prepared to file a formal report with the district office. What I witnessed constitutes sexual harassment at minimum, and possibly criminal behavior depending on whether any images were actually captured. The principal's face flushed slightly, and Emma could see anger flickering behind his diplomatic mask. Mrs. Henderson was threatening to escalate the situation beyond his control, to bring in outside authorities who might not be as invested in protecting Westfield High's reputation. Emma found herself caught between relief that someone was fighting for her and terror at the thought of this incident becoming even more public. Ellen, I think you're overreacting, Dr. Morrison said, his voice tighter than before. These are teenage girls, not criminal masterminds. Sometimes kids make poor choices, and our job is to guide them toward better behavior, not destroy their futures over a single mistake. Emma listened to the two adults argue over her trauma as if she weren't sitting right there, and something began to shift inside her. The fear and shame that had dominated her thoughts since the locker room incident were slowly being replaced by a cold, focused anger. These people were going to sweep this under the rug, protect the popular girls, and leave her to deal with the consequences alone. But Emma Rodriguez was done being invisible, done being the victim who absorbed abuse, and stayed silent. The quiet girl from Arizona who had spent 6 weeks hiding in corners was about to disappear forever, replaced by someone who understood that the only person who would truly fight for her was herself. Dr. Morrison finally turned his attention back to Emma, his expression attempting warmth but achieving only condescension. Emma, I'm going to speak with the other girls involved, and I'm confident we can resolve this situation quickly and quietly. In the meantime, I'd suggest you focus on settling in here at Westfield, making friends, getting involved in activities. Sometimes the best way to avoid conflict is to become part of the community. The suggestion that she was somehow responsible for avoiding future attacks by better integrating into the social hierarchy was the final straw. Emma looked at Dr. Morrison with new eyes, seeing him clearly for what he was, a bureaucrat more concerned with maintaining order than ensuring justice. She stood up slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled. "Dr. Morrison," Emma said, her voice carrying a strength that surprised even her. "I want you to know that I understand exactly what you're doing here. You're protecting them because they matter to this school, and I don't. Their families have influence, and mine doesn't. They bring prestige to Westfield High, and I'm just another enrollment number." The principal's eyebrows rose slightly, clearly taken aback by Emma's directness. "Emma, I'm not finished," Emma interrupted, and the quiet authority in her voice made Dr. Morrison close his mouth. "You're making a mistake if you think I'm going to just accept this and move on. What happened to me today was wrong, and if you won't do anything about it, I'll find someone who will." Mrs. Henderson smiled slightly, an expression of approval. That gave Emma additional strength. The pay teacher had been fighting this battle for decades, watching administrators choose convenience over justice time and time again. Emma's willingness to stand up for herself was clearly something the older woman respected. Dr. Morrison's face hardened, his diplomatic mask slipping to reveal the authoritarian underneath. "Miss Rodriguez, I would be very careful about making threats in my office. False accusations can have serious consequences, and you wouldn't want to damage your own reputation by spreading rumors about your fellow students." The threat was barely veiled, and Emma felt a flash of the same fear that had paralyzed her in the locker room. But this time, instead of shrinking away from the intimidation, she met Dr. Morrison's gaze directly. "It's not a threat, Dr. Morrison. It's a promise. And there's nothing false about what happened to me today." Emma turned and walked toward the door, leaving the principal and Mrs. Henderson to continue their bureaucratic battle. As she reached for the door handle, she paused and looked back over her shoulder. "Oh, and Dr. Morrison, you might want to think about what's going to happen when other students realize that popular kids can assault people in your school without consequences. I have a feeling I'm not the only girl who's been targeted by Ashley and her friends." The outer office was tense when Emma emerged, Ashley, Brittany, and Jessica sitting in chairs that suddenly seemed too small for their deflated confidence. They looked up as Emma passed, and she saw uncertainty in their eyes that hadn't been there before. They'd been counting on their usual immunity, their expectation that adults would protect them from any real consequences. Ashley's perfectly glossed lips curved into what might have been a smile, but her eyes held a different message entirely. "Hey, Emma," she said softly, her voice carrying just enough sweetness to sound innocent to any listening adults. "I hope you know there are no hard feelings about earlier. Sometimes these things just get blown out of proportion." Emma stopped walking and turned to face the three girls who had humiliated her just an hour earlier. For a moment, she saw them as they really were, not the powerful queens of Westfield High, but insecure teenagers who built themselves up by tearing others down. Their cruelty came from their own emptiness, their need to maintain their position in a social hierarchy that would collapse the moment people stopped being afraid of them. "You're right, Ashley," Emma said quietly. "Sometimes things do get blown out of proportion, but not today. Today, everything is exactly the right size." Emma walked away without looking back, leaving the three girls to puzzle over her cryptic response. She had no master plan yet, no clear strategy for revenge, but she had something more valuable, the absolute certainty that she was done being a victim. The quiet girl who had walked into that locker room was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that in a world where adults failed to protect the vulnerable, you had to learn to protect yourself. The hallways of Westfield High looked different now, less like a maze to be navigated and more like a stage where Emma was about to give the performance of her life. Students passed by without really seeing her, just as they had for the past 6 weeks, but that invisibility was about to become her greatest weapon. People ignored what they didn't understand, and Emma was planning to use their blindness against them. She made her way to her locker, spinning the combination with hands that were no longer shaking. The familiar ritual of opening the metal door felt different now, like she was opening more than just a storage space. Inside, tucked behind her textbooks, was her laptop computer, the one tool that might level the playing field between a nobody from Arizona and the reigning queens of a small Texas high school. Emma had always been good with technology, a skill she'd developed during long, lonely hours in Phoenix while her mother worked multiple jobs. She understood social media, video editing, digital forensics, and most importantly, she understood how information traveled in the modern world. Ashley, Brittany, and Jessica had made the mistake of underestimating the quiet girl with the secondhand clothes and the observant eyes. They were about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room was the one nobody bothered to notice. As Emma closed her locker and headed toward her next class, she began to plan. Not the wild, emotion-driven revenge fantasy of someone consumed by rage, but the calculated, methodical strategy of someone who had learned that justice was something you created for yourself. Ashley Parker and her crew had controlled Westfield High through fear, intimidation, and social manipulation. Emma Rodriguez was about to teach them that there were other kinds of power in the world, and some of them were far more dangerous than anything they could imagine. The bell for the next period rang through the hallways, but Emma didn't hurry to class. She had more important things to think about than American history or algebra too. She had a war to plan, and wars required preparation, patience, and perfect timing. Ashley, Brittany, and Jessica thought they had won by intimidating her into silence, by counting on the protection of an administration more concerned with reputation than justice. They had no idea that their victory was about to become the first battle in a conflict that would reshape the entire social structure of Westfield High. Emma smiled as she finally headed toward her classroom, already anticipating the moment when the hunters would become the hunted, when the queens would discover that their kingdom had been built on foundations far less solid than they had ever imagined. The quiet girl from Arizona was about to become very loud indeed. Emma Rodriguez sat in her small bedroom that evening, the laptop screen casting a blue glow across her determined face as she began to research everything she could find about Ashley Parker, Brittany Walsh, and Jessica Cole. The apartment was quiet except for the distant sound of her mother's television and the occasional rumble of traffic on the highway that ran behind their complex. Maria was working a double shift at Murphy's Diner, so Emma had hours of uninterrupted time to plan what would become the most sophisticated takedown in Westfield High's history. The first thing Emma discovered was that these girls had been terrorizing students for years, but their methods were always calculated to avoid leaving evidence. They were experts at psychological manipulation, at finding ways to humiliate and control their victims without crossing lines that would bring down administrative consequences. Emma found traces of their cruelty scattered across social media platforms, buried in comment threads and private group conversations that painted a picture of systematic bullying disguised as social leadership. Emma's fingers flew across the keyboard as she compiled a digital dossier on each girl. Ashley Parker, the undisputed leader, came from old money in Millbrook. Her father owned 3 car dealerships across East Texas, and her mother sat on the school board. Ashley's Instagram was a carefully curated showcase of privilege, each post designed to reinforce her status as Westfield High royalty, but Emma's technical skills allowed her to dig deeper, to access deleted posts, cached pages, and metadata that revealed a darker picture. Brittany Walsh was the enforcer of the group, the one who delivered the cruelest verbal attacks while Ashley maintained plausible deniability. Her family owned the largest real estate agency in town, and Brittany had never faced a consequence she couldn't buy her way out of. Her digital footprint showed a pattern of targeting vulnerable students, particularly those from lower-income families or minority backgrounds. Emma found screenshots and archived conversations that demonstrated a level of calculated cruelty that went far beyond typical teenage meanness. Jessica Cole was the athlete, the one who used her physical presence to intimidate while maintaining the facade of being the nice one of the group. Her volleyball scholarship to a Division II university was already secured, but Emma discovered that Jessica's academic eligibility was built on a foundation of academic dishonesty that would crumble under scrutiny. Grade changes, plagiarized papers, and test answers leaked by sympathetic teachers created a web of corruption that extended into the faculty itself. As Emma dug deeper into the digital lives of her tormentors, she began to understand the scope of their influence and the network of enablers who had allowed their behavior to continue unchecked. Teachers who looked the other way, administrators who protected donors' children, and a student body too intimidated to speak up against the established hierarchy. Emma realized that exposing one incident wouldn't be enough. She needed to dismantle the entire system that had created and protected these bullies. Emma's plan began to take shape as she worked through the night, fueled by determination and the kind of focused energy that comes from having a clear purpose for the first time in months. She wouldn't just expose what had happened to her in the locker room. She would create a comprehensive expose that revealed years of abuse, corruption, and institutional failure. The video she planned would be more than revenge. It would be a reckoning. Over the next 2 weeks, Emma became a shadow within Westfield High's social ecosystem, using her natural invisibility to gather intelligence and document evidence. She carried a small digital recorder in her backpack, capturing conversations that revealed the true nature of the school's social dynamics. She photographed text messages displayed on unlocked phones, archived social media posts before they could be deleted, and mapped the network of students who had been victimized by Ashley's crew over the years. Emma's technical skills proved invaluable as she began to piece together a timeline of abuse that stretched back to freshman year. She discovered that the locker room incident wasn't an escalation, but a continuation of a pattern that had destroyed the high school experience for dozens of students. Some had transferred schools, others had developed eating disorders or depression, and a few had simply disappeared from the social fabric of Westfield High, becoming invisible in the same way Emma had been before her transformation. The breakthrough came when Emma gained access to the private group chat that Ashley, Brittany, and Jessica used to coordinate their attacks. Through a combination of social engineering and technical exploitation, Emma was able to read months of conversations that revealed not just their past crimes, but their future plans. They had already identified their next targets, students who were guilty of nothing more than being different or vulnerable. Emma read message after message, detailing the systematic destruction of other students' reputations, relationships, and mental health. The casual cruelty was breathtaking. The way these girls discussed ruining lives as if they were planning weekend activities. Emma realized that she wasn't just fighting for her own dignity. She was fighting for every student who had ever been targeted by this toxic hierarchy. The video Emma created was unlike anything Westfield High had ever seen. Using advanced editing software she had taught herself, Emma wove together a narrative that was part documentary, part expose, and part call to action. She used voice modulation to protect her identity while presenting evidence that was irrefutable and devastating. The video opened with a recreation of her own assault in the locker room, but quickly expanded to reveal the broader pattern of abuse that had defined these girls' reign of terror. Emma included audio recordings of Ashley laughing about a freshman girl's suicide attempt, video evidence of Brittany orchestrating the social isolation of students based on their economic status, and text messages showing Jessica's involvement in academic fraud that implicated several faculty members. Each revelation was carefully documented and verified, creating a case that would be impossible for administrators to dismiss or minimize. But Emma's masterstroke was the way she presented the evidence. Rather than simply dumping information, she created a compelling narrative that showed how the toxic culture at Westfield High had been enabled by adults who chose convenience over courage. She exposed Dr. Morrison's pattern of protecting wealthy students while sacrificing the vulnerable, Mrs. Patterson's habit of changing grades for student athletes, and the systematic way that certain families bought their children immunity from consequences. Emma's video was scheduled to premiere during the school's quarterly assembly, when the entire student body and faculty would be gathered in the auditorium. She had hacked into the school's audiovisual system weeks earlier, ensuring that her presentation would override whatever sanitized programming Dr. Morrison had planned. The timing was perfect. The spring semester was ending, college acceptances were being finalized, and the social order that had defined Westfield High for years was about to be permanently shattered. The morning of the assembly, Emma sat in her usual spot at the back of the auditorium, watching as students filed in with the bored resignation typical of mandatory school events. Ashley, Brittany, and Jessica took their customary places in the front rows, their presence commanding attention even in a crowd of hundreds. They had no idea that their entire world was about to collapse around them. Dr. Morrison took the stage with his usual bureaucratic confidence, beginning his remarks about school spirit and academic achievement. Emma watched the principal's face carefully, knowing that in a few minutes his carefully maintained composure would be replaced by panic and damage control. The irony wasn't lost on her that the man who had dismissed her trauma as a misunderstanding was about to learn the cost of institutional indifference. When Emma's video began playing on the large screens throughout the auditorium, the effect was immediate and electric. The first few seconds showed a perfect recreation of what had happened in the locker room, but with Emma's face obscured and her voice disguised. The gasps from the audience were audible as they realized they were witnessing something unprecedented, something that would change Westfield High forever. As the video progressed through its carefully constructed narrative, Emma watched the faces of her tormentors transform from confusion to horror to desperate calculation. Ashley's perfect composure cracked completely when her own voice was played back, casually discussing the psychological destruction of a student who had later attempted suicide. Brittany's face went ashen when text messages revealing her systematic targeting of minority students were displayed for the entire school to see. The faculty section of the auditorium was in chaos as teachers realized that their own complicity was being exposed. Mrs. Patterson actually stood up and tried to leave when evidence of her grade-changing scheme was presented, but the auditorium doors had been electronically locked as part of Emma's hack. Everyone would see the complete presentation, no matter how uncomfortable it made them. Dr. Morrison frantically gestured to the technology staff, trying to regain control of his audiovisual system, but Emma's preparation was thorough. She had anticipated every possible countermeasure and designed her hack to be uninterruptible. The video would play in its entirety, and every person in that auditorium would understand exactly how toxic their school's culture had become. The climax of Emma's presentation came when she revealed the private group chat conversations in their full, unedited glory. Message after message of calculated cruelty scrolled across the screens, each one more damaging than the last. The casual way Ashley, Brittany, and Jessica discussed destroying other students' lives was laid bare for everyone to see, including the specific students they had targeted and the methods they had used. Emma had saved the most devastating revelation for last, the evidence that Dr. Morrison himself had received multiple reports about these girls' behavior over the years and had consistently chosen to protect them rather than their victims. Parent complaints, teacher concerns, and student reports had all been buried or ignored. creating a pattern of institutional failure that enabled years of abuse. As the video concluded with a call for accountability and systemic change, the auditorium was completely silent. Emma looked around at the faces of her classmates, seeing shock, anger, recognition, and in some cases, relief that someone had finally spoken truth to power. The social hierarchy that had defined Westfield High for so long was crumbling in real time, and everyone present knew they were witnessing history. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Ashley, Brittany, and Jessica were immediately suspended pending a district investigation, their college scholarships and acceptances hanging in the balance as the evidence of their behavior spread beyond Westfield High. Dr. Morrison was placed on administrative leave within hours as the school board launched their own inquiry into his handling of bullying complaints. Emma's video went viral within days, shared across social media platforms, and picked up by local news stations as an example of how students could use technology to demand accountability from failing institutions. The hashtag Westfield Truth began trending as other students from schools across the country shared their own stories of institutional betrayal and administrative indifference. But perhaps the most significant change was in the culture of Westfield High itself. Students who had been silent for years began speaking up about their own experiences with bullying and discrimination. The code of silence that had protected the toxic hierarchy was broken, replaced by a new understanding that everyone had a responsibility to create a safer, more inclusive environment. Emma revealed her identity as the video's creator in an interview with the local newspaper, explaining that she had chosen to speak up not just for herself but for every student who had ever been silenced by fear or institutional indifference. Her transformation from invisible victim to powerful advocate inspired other students to find their own voices and demand better from the adults responsible for their safety and education. Ashley Parker's family quietly moved away from Millbrook. Before the spring semester ended, her father's car dealership sold and her mother's resignation from the school board submitted in disgrace. Brittany Walsh lost her early admission to her preferred university when evidence of her discriminatory behavior reached their admissions office. Jessica Cole's volleyball scholarship was revoked when the academic fraud investigation revealed the extent of her dishonesty. Emma's mother Maria was initially terrified when she learned about her daughter's actions, worried about retaliation and consequences. But as the community rallied around Emma's courage and the positive changes began to take root at Westfield High, Maria realized that her quiet daughter had found a strength and purpose that would serve her well for the rest of her life. The new principal who replaced Dr. Morrison implemented comprehensive anti-bullying policies and created anonymous reporting systems that actually resulted in meaningful consequences for perpetrators. Teachers received training on recognizing and addressing harassment, and the school board adopted transparency measures designed to prevent the kind of corruption that had protected Ashley's crew for so long. Emma's story became a case study in how individual courage could create systemic change, proof that even the quietest voices could become powerful when amplified by truth and determination. She was invited to speak at conferences about cyberbullying, student advocacy, and the responsibility of institutions to protect their most vulnerable members. The girl who had once hidden in corners and hoped to remain invisible had become a leader and an inspiration, showing that sometimes the most powerful response to cruelty was not silence or submission, but strategic, decisive action. Emma's transformation from victim to victor wasn't just personal. It was a catalyst for change that made Westfield High a better place for every student who walked its hallways. As Emma prepared to graduate and move on to college with a full scholarship earned through her advocacy work, she reflected on how much had changed since that terrible day in the locker room. The quiet girl from Arizona had found her voice and, in doing so, had helped countless others find theirs as well. Ashley, Brittany, and Jessica had tried to break her spirit and destroy her dignity, But instead they had awakened a force for justice that would reshape their entire community. Emma's story proved that in a world where adults sometimes failed to protect the vulnerable, young people could learn to protect themselves and each other. Her brutal revenge wasn't just about evening the score. It was about creating a future where no student would have to endure what she had experienced in silence and isolation. The shy girl who had once trembled in locker rooms had become a warrior for justice, and her victory belonged not just to her, but to every student who had ever been told their voice didn't matter. Emma Rodriguez had shown them all that it did. 3 months after the assembly that changed everything, Emma Rodriguez walked through the hallways of Westfield High with a confidence that would have been unimaginable just a semester earlier. The transformation wasn't just in her posture or the way she carried herself, though those changes were remarkable enough. The real difference was in the school itself, in the way students interacted with each other and the way teachers and administrators approached their responsibilities to protect and nurture their charges. The morning sun streamed through the large windows of the main corridor, illuminating faces that looked genuinely happier than they had in years. Students who had once walked with their heads down, afraid of drawing unwanted attention, now moved with purpose and dignity. The toxic atmosphere that had poisoned Westfield High for so long had been replaced by something healthier, something that allowed young people to focus on learning and growing rather than simply surviving. Emma paused. At her locker, the same metal box that had once felt like a fortress against the hostile world around her. Now it was simply what it was meant to be, a place to store books and supplies between classes. The combination spun easily under her fingers, muscle memory that no longer carried the weight of anxiety and fear. Inside, mixed with her textbooks and binders, were letters from students across the country who had seen her story and found the courage to speak up about their own experiences with bullying and institutional indifference. The ripple effects of Emma's actions had spread far beyond the borders of Millbrook, Texas. Her video had been viewed millions of times, shared by anti-bullying organizations, education advocates, and student rights groups as an example of how young people could demand accountability from the systems meant to protect them. Emma had received speaking invitations from schools, conferences, and youth organizations, all wanting to hear directly from the quiet girl who had found her voice in such a dramatic way. But perhaps more meaningful than the national attention were the changes she could see every day in the hallways of her own school. Students who had once been invisible were finding their voices, speaking up in class discussions, joining clubs and activities, forming friendships that crossed the rigid social boundaries that had previously defined teenage life at Westfield High. The culture of fear that had allowed bullies to operate with impunity had been replaced by a culture of mutual support and accountability. Emma's phone buzzed with a text message from Tyler Jackson, a sophomore who had become one of her closest allies in the ongoing effort to maintain the positive changes at Westfield High. Tyler had been one of Ashley's targets before Emma's intervention. A quiet kid whose crime had been being too smart and not athletic enough for the social hierarchy that ruled the school. Now he was thriving, his natural intelligence and kindness finally given space to flourish. The message was brief but significant. Check the news. Ashley's transfer application was denied again. Emma smiled as she read the words, not out of cruelty, but out of satisfaction that justice was continuing to unfold even months after her initial revelation. Ashley Parker's attempts to restart her senior year at a private school in Dallas had been unsuccessful, largely because Emma's video had created a digital record that followed her wherever she tried to go. The truth was that Ashley, Brittany, and Jessica had become cautionary tales, their names permanently associated with the kind of behavior that enlightened educational institutions were working to eliminate. Their attempts to rebrand themselves or minimize their actions had been futile because Emma's documentation had been so thorough and so widely disseminated. They were learning, perhaps for the first time in their lives, that actions had consequences that couldn't be bought off or explained away. Emma made her way to the media center, a space that had become her unofficial headquarters for the ongoing projects that had grown out of her initial act of rebellion. Mrs. Davidson, the new principal who had replaced Dr. Marison, had given Emma unprecedented access to the school's technology resources, recognizing that her skills and passion were assets that could benefit the entire student body. The media center buzzed with activity as students worked on various projects under Emma's guidance. There was a group creating an anti-bullying presentation for middle schools in the district, another developing a peer counseling program for students dealing with harassment, and a third working on a documentary about how institutional change happens at the grassroots level. Emma had become not just an advocate, but a mentor, helping other students find ways to channel their experiences into positive action. Sarah Chun, a freshman who reminded Emma of herself just a year earlier, looked up from her computer screen with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. "Emma, I finished the script for the presentation we're giving to the 8th graders next week. Do you want to review it?" The girl's voice carried the same tentative quality that Emma remembered from her own early days at Westfield, but there was an underlying confidence that spoke to how much the school culture had changed. Emma pulled up a chair next to Sarah and began reading through the presentation, offering suggestions and encouragement. The script was powerful, addressing the reality of teenage cruelty while also emphasizing the importance of speaking up and seeking help. More importantly, it reflected the new understanding that had taken root at Westfield High, that bullying thrived in silence and secrecy, but withered when exposed to light and accountability. As Emma worked with Sarah and the other students, she reflected on how different her life had become since that terrible day in the locker room. The girl who had once eaten lunch alone now found herself surrounded by friends and allies, students who respected her not because of her social status or family wealth, but because of her courage and integrity. The transformation felt almost miraculous, except that Emma understood it hadn't been magic, but rather the hard work of standing up for what was right. The lunch period brought Emma to the cafeteria, another space that had been transformed by the cultural shift at Westfield High. The rigid social geography that had once defined who could sit where had given way to a more fluid, inclusive atmosphere. Students mixed across traditional boundaries, united by shared interests and genuine friendships rather than artificial hierarchies based on wealth, athleticism, or family connections. Emma joined a table that included Tyler, Sarah, Marcus Williams from the drama club, and several other students who had become part of the informal network of change agents that had emerged in the wake of her video. The conversation was animated and optimistic, focused on upcoming projects and positive developments rather than the gossip and character assassination that had once dominated teenage discourse at the school. Marcus was particularly excited about the upcoming spring production, a student-written play about finding your voice in the face of adversity. "The turnout for auditions was incredible," he reported between bites of his sandwich. "We had kids try out who have never been involved in theater before, kids who said they were inspired by everything that's happened here to try something new." The play was just one example of how Emma's actions had unleashed a wave of creativity and self-expression that had been suppressed by the previous toxic culture. Students were writing, performing, creating art, and engaging in activism with an energy that teachers and administrators found both inspiring and slightly overwhelming. The fear that had once paralyzed so many young people had been replaced by hope and determination. Emma's phone rang during lunch, displaying the number of Rebecca Martinez, a reporter from the Dallas Morning News who had been following the ongoing story of transformation at Westfield High. Emma had become comfortable with media interviews, understanding that sharing her story publicly was part of her responsibility to other students facing similar situations. "Hi, Rebecca," Emma answered, stepping away from the lunch table to take the call. "What's happening?" Rebecca's voice carried excitement that was immediately contagious. "Emma, I wanted to let you know that the State Department of Education has announced they're using Westfield High as a model for their new anti-bullying initiative. Your story and the changes at your school are going to be featured in training materials for principals and teachers across Texas." The news was simultaneously thrilling and overwhelming. Emma had never imagined that her personal fight for dignity and justice would become a statewide example of institutional change. The quiet girl from Arizona who had once hidden in corners was now influencing education policy across one of the nation's largest states. After finishing the call, Emma returned to her table to share the news with her friends. The reaction was a mixture of pride and determination to live up to the responsibility that came with being a model for positive change. These students understood that they were part of something larger than themselves, that their school had become a symbol of what was possible when young people refused to accept injustice as inevitable. The afternoon brought Emma to her favorite class, Advanced Digital Media, where she was working on a project that represented the next evolution of her advocacy work. Rather than simply exposing problems, Emma was now focused on creating solutions, developing tools and resources that could help other students and schools address bullying and institutional indifference before they reached crisis levels. Her current project was a mobile app that would allow students to anonymously report harassment and track whether their concerns were being addressed appropriately by school administrators. The app included resources for students dealing with bullying, legal information about their rights, and connections to mental health support services. Emma's technical skills, honed through years of self-directed learning, were now being applied to create systemic solutions rather than individual revenge. Mrs. Peterson, the digital media teacher, stopped by Emma's workstation to check on her progress. "This is really impressive work, Emma. Have you given any thought to studying computer science or digital advocacy in college?" The question reflected how much Emma's identity had expanded beyond her role as a bullying victim to encompass her skills as a technology innovator and social entrepreneur. Emma had indeed been thinking about her future, and the possibilities seemed limitless in a way that would have been unthinkable just a year earlier. Colleges that specialized in social justice, technology for good, and digital media were actively recruiting her, impressed not just by her technical abilities, but by her demonstrated capacity to create positive change. The girl who had once worried about simply surviving high school was now being courted by institutions that wanted to help her change the world. As the school day ended, Emma made her way to the auditorium for a special assembly that represented the culmination of months of work by students, teachers, and administrators. Today, Westfield High was officially launching its new peer mediation program, a student-led initiative designed to address conflicts before they escalated into harassment or violence. The auditorium that had once been the site of Emma's dramatic revelation was now filled with a completely different energy. Students, teachers, parents, and community members had gathered to celebrate the transformation of their school and to commit to maintaining the positive changes that had been achieved. Emma took a seat in the front row, a position she would never have claimed during her early days at Westfield, but now occupied naturally as one of the school's recognized leaders. Mrs. Davidson, the principal, took the stage with a confidence and warmth that stood in stark contrast to Dr. Morrison's bureaucratic coldness. 8 months ago, this school was forced to confront some uncomfortable truths about our culture and our failures to protect all of our students, she began. Today, we're here to celebrate how far we've come and to commit to never going back to the way things were. The applause that followed was genuine and enthusiastic, reflecting the authentic pride that the Westfield High community felt about their transformation. Emma listened as Mrs. Davidson outlined the specific changes that had been implemented: new reporting procedures, revised disciplinary policies, enhanced training for staff, and most importantly, a fundamental shift in how the school understood its responsibility to create a safe and inclusive environment for all students. When Mrs. Davidson called Emma to the stage to speak about the peer mediation program, the standing ovation that greeted her was overwhelming. Emma looked out at the faces in the audience and saw not just her classmates and teachers, but representatives from other schools, district officials, and even some state education department personnel who had come to learn from Westfield's example. Emma's speech was brief but powerful, focusing on the importance of giving students agency in creating the kind of school culture they wanted to experience. "Change doesn't happen because adults decide it should happen," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium. "Change happens because students decide they deserve better and they're willing to work for it." The presentation of the peer mediation program was followed by testimonials from students whose lives had been changed by the cultural transformation at Westfield High. Emma listened to story after story of students finding their voices, building confidence, pursuing interests they had been afraid to explore, and forming friendships across traditional social boundaries. One particularly moving testimony came from David Rodriguez, no relation to Emma despite the shared surname, who had been contemplating suicide during his sophomore year because of relentless harassment. David credited Emma's courage in speaking up, with giving him the hope and support he needed to not only survive, but thrive. He was now a junior, active in student government, and passionate about mental health advocacy. As the assembly concluded and people began to file out of the auditorium, Emma was approached by a woman she didn't recognize, someone who had been sitting in the back row taking notes throughout the presentation. The woman introduced herself as Dr. Patricia Williams from the University of Texas, where she directed a program focused on digital activism and social change. "Emma, I've been following your story for months, and I'm incredibly impressed by what you've accomplished here," Dr. Williams said. "I wanted to personally invite you to consider our program for your undergraduate studies. We have a special track for students like you who have demonstrated the ability to use technology for social good." The invitation was one of several that Emma had received from universities across the country, all of them recognizing that her combination of technical skills, leadership ability, and commitment to justice made her an ideal candidate for programs focused on creating positive social change. The opportunities were exciting, but also somewhat overwhelming for a girl who had once believed her only goal was to survive high school without drawing unwanted attention. As Emma walked home that evening, she reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her from the terrified victim in the locker room to the confident advocate and leader she had become. The transformation hadn't been easy or quick, and there had been moments when the pressure and responsibility felt overwhelming. But every step had been worth it, not just for her own healing and growth, but for the positive impact on so many other students' lives. The apartment complex where Emma lived with her mother had also been touched by the changes in her life. Maria Rodriguez had been initially terrified by her daughter's decision to speak up so publicly, worried about retaliation and consequences. But as the community rallied around Emma and recognized her courage, Maria had found herself welcomed into social circles and support networks that she had never experienced before. Maria was waiting in their small living room when Emma arrived home, her face glowing with pride and excitement. "Mia, you'll never guess what happened today," she said, embracing her daughter with the fierce love that had carried them through so many difficult times. "Mrs. Patterson from the school board called to ask if I would be interested in joining a new parent advisory committee they're forming." The invitation reflected how much had changed for their entire family. 6 months earlier, Maria had been just another invisible single mother working multiple jobs to make ends meet. Now she was being recognized as someone whose perspective and experience could contribute to positive change in the educational system. Emma's courage had not only transformed her own life, but had elevated her mother's status in the community as well. That evening, as Emma worked on college applications and scholarship essays, She found herself struggling to capture the magnitude of everything that had changed since that terrible day in the locker room. How do you explain that being assaulted and humiliated had ultimately become the catalyst for the most meaningful period of your life? How do you convey that your worst experience had led to your greatest triumph? Emma's essay for the University of Texas application focused on the concept of transformative adversity, the idea that sometimes the most painful experiences in life become the foundation for the most important work you'll ever do. She wrote about learning that justice wasn't something that happened to you, but something you created through your own actions and choices. The responses to Emma's college applications were overwhelmingly positive, with multiple universities offering full scholarships and special program opportunities. But more meaningful than the academic recognition were the ongoing messages from students across the country who had been inspired by her story to speak up about their own experiences with bullying and institutional indifference. Emma's inbox was constantly filled with emails from young people who credited her courage with giving them the strength to report harassment, seek help for mental health issues, or simply believe that their voices mattered. Each message was a reminder that her decision to fight back had ripple effects that extended far beyond Westfield High and would continue to impact lives for years to come. As spring semester drew to a close and graduation approached, Emma found herself feeling nostalgic about leaving Westfield High despite everything she had endured there. The school had become not just the site of her trauma, but the place where she had discovered her strength, found her voice, and learned that one person really could make a difference. The graduation ceremony was held on a perfect May evening, with the late afternoon sun casting golden light across the football field where the entire senior class gathered to celebrate the completion of their high school journey. Emma sat with her fellow graduates, wearing her cap and gown with a pride that would have been unimaginable just a year earlier. When Emma's name was called and she walked across the stage to receive her diploma, the applause was thunderous and sustained, reflecting not just her academic achievements, but the respect and admiration of a community that had been transformed by her courage. Mrs. Davidson presented her diploma with a smile that conveyed both pride and gratitude for everything Emma had contributed to Westfield High. The valedictorian speech, delivered by Marcus Williams, included an extended tribute to Emma and the other students who had worked to create positive change at their school. We're graduating not just as individuals, but as a class that proved young people have the power to demand better from the institutions that are supposed to serve us, Marcus said, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd of families and community members. After the ceremony, as families gathered for photos and celebrations, Emma was approached by Ashley Parker's younger sister, Madison, who would be a freshman at Westfield High in the fall. Madison was nervous but determined as she spoke to Emma, her voice carrying the same tentative quality that Emma remembered from her own early days at the school. "I wanted to thank you," Madison said quietly. "I know what my sister did was wrong, and I know the whole family paid a price for it. But honestly, seeing what you've done here, seeing how the school has changed, it makes me feel like I can actually look forward to high school instead of dreading it." The conversation with Madison was a powerful reminder that change is generational, that the work Emma had done would continue to benefit students who weren't even at Westfield High during the original crisis. Ashley's sister would enter a school that had been fundamentally transformed by Emma's courage. A place where bullying was no longer tolerated and students felt empowered to speak up for themselves and others. As the graduation celebration wound down and families began to head home, Emma stood on the football field, where she had received her diploma, and looked back at the school building that had been the site of both her greatest trauma and her most significant triumph. Westfield High would always be part of her story, but now it was a chapter about strength and transformation rather than victimization and fear. Emma's phone buzzed with a final message of the evening, this one from a student at a high school in Oregon who had just launched their own campaign against institutional bullying, inspired by Emma's example. "Thank you for showing us that we don't have to accept injustice," the message read. "You changed everything for so many of us." As Emma Rodriguez walked away from Westfield High for the last time as a student, she carried with her not just a diploma, but the knowledge that she had discovered her life's purpose. The quiet girl from Arizona who had once hidden in corners had become a voice for justice, and her story would continue to inspire others long after she had moved on to the next chapter of her life. The brutal revenge she had taken on her tormentors had evolved into something much more meaningful, a legacy of positive change that would protect and empower students for generations to come. Ashley, Brittany, and Jessica had tried to break her spirit, but instead they had forged a warrior for justice whose impact would be felt far beyond the borders of one small Texas town. 5 years had passed since Emma Rodriguez walked across the graduation stage at Westfield High, and the young woman who now stood before a packed auditorium at the University of Texas bore little resemblance to the frightened girl who had once cowered in locker room corners. Emma's transformation into one of the nation's most respected advocates for student rights and digital justice had been remarkable. But perhaps more impressive was how she had managed to maintain her humanity and kosher compassion throughout her meteoric rise to prominence. The auditorium at UT's LBJ School of Public Affairs was filled to capacity, with students, faculty, administrators, and education policymakers from across the country gathered to hear Emma deliver the keynote address at the National Conference on Digital Activism in Education. At 23, she was completing her master's degree in digital policy and social change, while simultaneously running her nonprofit organization, Student Voice Coalition, which had become the premier advocacy group for young people facing institutional discrimination and harassment. Emma's journey from victim to victor had captivated the nation, but what made her story truly extraordinary was how she had leveraged her personal experience into systemic change that protected millions of students across the country. Her mobile app for reporting harassment had been adopted by over 3,000 schools nationwide. Her documentary about institutional bullying had won 3 Emmy Awards, and her testimony before Congress had led to the passage of federal legislation strengthening protections for students facing discrimination. As Emma stepped up to the podium, she looked out at the sea of faces and thought about how different this moment was from that terrifying day in the Westfield High locker room. The fear and powerlessness she had felt then seemed like a lifetime ago, replaced by a deep sense of purpose and the knowledge that her voice could create real change in the world. The girl who had once been silenced by shame and intimidation had become someone whose words carried weight in the halls of power. Emma's speech began with a story that had become familiar to those who followed her work, but she told it with fresh passion and insight that reflected her continued growth as both an advocate and a human being. She spoke about the moment she realized that her assault wasn't just a personal trauma, but a symptom of systemic failures that affected countless other students. That realization had transformed her from a victim seeking revenge into a reformer seeking justice. The audience listened with rapt attention as Emma described the years of work that had followed her initial viral video. The countless hours spent refining her app, the legal battles to protect student privacy rights, the lobbying efforts to change federal education policy, and most importantly, the ongoing work of supporting individual students who found themselves in situations similar to what she had experienced at Westfield High. Emma's organization, Student Voice Coalition, had grown from a one-person operation run out of her college dorm room into a nationally recognized nonprofit with offices in 5 major cities and a staff of 42 dedicated advocates, counselors, and technology specialists. The organization provided direct support to students facing harassment, trained school administrators on best practices for handling bullying complaints, and worked with lawmakers to strengthen legal protections for vulnerable young people. 1. Of Emma's proudest accomplishments was the Student Bill of Rights that her organization had helped draft and lobby into law in 12 states, with similar legislation pending in 18 others. The bill established clear standards for how schools must respond to harassment complaints, created independent oversight mechanisms to ensure accountability, and gave students legal recourse when institutions failed to protect them. The personal cost of Emma's advocacy work had been significant at times. The constant travel, the emotional weight of supporting traumatized young people, and the pressure of being a public figure had taken their toll. Emma had learned to practice self-care and maintain boundaries, but she had also accepted that her life would always be shaped by the responsibility she felt to use her platform for positive change. Emma's romantic life had been complicated by her public profile and demanding schedule, but she had found love with Dr. James Chun, a fellow graduate student who shared her passion for social justice and understood the demands of advocacy work. James was completing his PhD in educational psychology, and their relationship was built on mutual respect, shared values, and a deep commitment to making the world a better place for young people. The couple had met during a research project on trauma-informed education practices, and their partnership had enriched both their personal and professional lives. James's expertise in adolescent psychology complemented Emma's technology and policy background, and they often collaborated on projects that combined their different areas of expertise to create more comprehensive solutions to educational challenges. Emma's relationship with her mother Maria had also deepened over the years, evolving from the protective parent-child dynamic of her high school years into a partnership between two strong women who supported each other's dreams and ambitions. Maria had eventually left her job at Murphy's Diner to become the office manager for Student Voice Coalition, bringing her organizational skills and fierce protective instincts to bear on behalf of vulnerable students across the country. The success of Emma's advocacy work had brought unexpected financial rewards as well. Her speaking fees, book royalties, and consulting contracts had lifted the Rodriguez family out of the economic insecurity that had defined Emma's childhood. They had purchased a comfortable home in Austin, and Maria no longer worried about paying bills or affording health care. Emma took pride in being able to provide for her mother after all the sacrifices Maria had made during their difficult years in Millbrook. As Emma continued her keynote address, she shared updates on some of the students her organization had helped over the years. There was David Martinez, a transgender student in Colorado whose harassment complaint had been ignored by his school district until Student Voice Coalition intervened with legal action that resulted in a comprehensive policy change and a settlement that funded LGBT+ support programs. There was Sarah Kim, an Asian American student in California who had faced racist bullying that escalated to physical violence before. Emma's organization helped expose a pattern of discrimination that led to federal civil rights investigation. Each success story represented not just an individual victory, but proof that systemic change was possible when advocates refused to accept injustice as inevitable. Emma's work had shown that the combination of technology, legal advocacy, and grassroots organizing could create lasting improvements in how institutions protected their most vulnerable members. Emma also spoke honestly about the failures and setbacks that had marked her advocacy journey. There were students she hadn't been able to help in time, legal battles that had been lost, and policy changes that had been watered down by political compromise. These experiences had taught her that change was slow and difficult, but they had also reinforced her commitment to continuing the fight even when progress felt frustratingly incremental. One of the most challenging aspects of Emma's work was dealing with the ongoing presence of Ashley Parker, Brittany Walsh, and Jessica Cole in her life. Even years after their graduation from Westfield High, all three women had eventually found ways to rebuild their lives and careers, but their past actions continued to shadow their attempts at reinvention. Ashley had completed her degree at a small private college in Louisiana and was working in her father's business, but her attempts to establish herself in Texas political circles had been repeatedly derailed by the digital record of her behavior. At Westfield High, Emma's thorough documentation had created a permanent accountability that followed Ashley wherever she tried to go. Brittany had moved to California and was working in real estate like her parents, but her discriminatory behavior at Westfield High had become a cautionary tale used in diversity training programs across the country. She had reached out to Emma several times over the years, seeking some kind of absolution or public forgiveness that might help rehabilitate her reputation, but Emma had declined these overtures. Jessica's athletic career had ended when her volleyball scholarship was revoked, and she had struggled to find direction in her post-high school life. She had completed a degree at a community college and was working as a personal trainer, but the promise of athletic stardom that had once defined her identity was gone forever. Emma felt no satisfaction in the ongoing struggles of her former tormentors, but she also felt no obligation to help them escape the consequences of their actions. Their choices had created lasting trauma for multiple victims, and Emma believed that accountability was a necessary part of any genuine healing process. The question of forgiveness was one that Emma grappled with regularly, both in her personal healing journey and in her work with other survivors of harassment and assault. She had learned that forgiveness was a personal choice that couldn't be demanded or expected, and that healing was possible even without reconciliation with those who had caused harm. Emma's keynote address concluded with a call to action that challenged everyone in the audience to consider their own role in creating more just and equitable educational environments. She emphasized that change couldn't be left to survivors and victims alone, that it required commitment from educators, administrators, policymakers, and community members who were willing to prioritize student safety over institutional convenience. The standing ovation that followed Emma's speech was sustained and enthusiastic, reflecting the audience's appreciation for both her message and her journey. During the question and answer session that followed, Emma fielded inquiries about everything from technology solutions to policy recommendations to personal resilience strategies. One particularly moving question came from a high school senior in the audience who identified herself as a current victim of harassment at her school in Missouri. The girl described a situation that was eerily similar to what Emma had experienced at Westfield High, and asked for advice on how to advocate for herself when adults seemed unwilling to help. Emma's response was compassionate but direct, emphasizing the importance of documentation, the value of finding adult allies even if they weren't in positions of formal authority, and the power of connecting with other students who shared similar experiences. She also provided the girl with contact information for Student Voice Coalition's direct support services, ensuring that she would have professional advocates available to help navigate her situation. After the conference concluded, Emma was approached by Dr. Patricia Williams, the professor who had first recruited her to UT, and who had become both a mentor and a close friend over the years. Dr. Williams had been following Emma's career with pride and had played a crucial role in connecting her with the resources and opportunities that had enabled her rapid rise in the advocacy world. "Emma, I have something I want to discuss with you," Dr. Williams said, her expression carrying the kind of excitement that suggested significant news. "The MacArthur Foundation has been in touch with me about their next round of Genius grants. Your work has caught their attention, and they're considering you for recognition as an exceptional leader in social innovation." The MacArthur Fellowship, commonly known as the Genius Grant, was one of the most prestigious awards available to American innovators and changemakers. The recognition would not only validate Emma's work, but provide substantial financial resources to expand Student Voice Coalition's programs and impact. Emma felt overwhelmed by the possibility, remembering the frightened girl who had once believed her only goal was surviving high school without drawing unwanted attention. The idea that she might be recognized as a genius for work that had grown out of her personal trauma felt both surreal and deeply meaningful. That evening, Emma called her mother to share the news about the potential MacArthur Fellowship recognition. Maria's reaction was a mixture of pride, excitement, and continued amazement at how much their lives had changed since those difficult days in Millbrook. "Mia, do you ever think about what would have happened if you had stayed quiet that day?" Maria asked, her voice carrying the weight of reflection on their shared journey. "If you had just accepted what those girls did to you and tried to move on?" Emma considered the question seriously, as she often did when contemplating the pivotal moments that had shaped her life. "I think about it sometimes, Mama. I think I would have carried that shame and anger for the rest of my life. I think other students would have continued to suffer because no one was willing to speak up. I think institutions would have continued to protect bullies instead of victims." The conversation with her mother reinforced Emma's understanding that her decision to fight back had been about much more than personal revenge. It had been about refusing to accept a world where vulnerability was punished and cruelty was rewarded, where young people were expected to endure abuse in silence while adults looked the other way. As Emma prepared for bed that night in her comfortable Austin apartment, she reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her from that terrifying moment in the Westfield High locker room to this moment of potential recognition as one of the nation's most innovative social change agents. The path had been difficult and sometimes painful, but it had also been deeply meaningful in ways she never could have imagined. Emma's bedtime routine now included reading messages from students across the country who had been helped by her organization's work. Tonight's messages included updates from a girl in Michigan whose harassment complaint had finally been taken seriously after Student Voice Coalition's intervention, a boy in Florida who had successfully transferred schools after his administrators failed to protect him from bullying, and a non-binary student in Oregon who had won a legal victory that established new protections for transgender students in their district. Each message was a reminder that Emma's personal trauma had been transformed into a force for healing and justice that reached far beyond her own experience. The girl who had once felt powerless and alone had created a network of support and advocacy that ensured no student would have to face harassment without allies and resources. Emma's final thoughts before sleep were about the future, both her own and the broader movement for student rights that she had helped to create. She was considering pursuing a PhD in education policy after completing her master's degree, with the goal of eventually teaching and training the next generation of advocates and reformers. There was also the possibility of running for political office, using her platform and experience to create change from within governmental institutions, rather than just pressuring them from the outside. Several political mentors had encouraged Emma to consider a future in elected office, suggesting that her combination of policy expertise, technological innovation, and grassroots credibility made her an ideal candidate for legislative leadership. But regardless of the specific path her career took, Emma knew that her fundamental mission would remain the same, ensuring that young people had the tools, resources, and support they needed to speak up against injustice and demand better from the institutions meant to serve them. As sleep finally claimed her, Emma's last conscious thought was a moment of gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this point. Ashley Parker, Brittany Walsh, and Jessica Cole had intended to break her spirit and destroy her dignity. But instead they had awakened a force for justice that would protect and empower students for generations to come. The quiet girl from Arizona who had once hidden in corners had become a voice that echoed in congressional hearing rooms, corporate boardrooms, and school districts across the nation. Her brutal revenge had evolved into something much more powerful, a legacy of positive change that would outlast any individual victory or defeat. Emma Rodriguez had learned that the most effective response to cruelty wasn't more cruelty, but rather the patient, persistent work of building a world where cruelty could no longer flourish unchallenged. Her story had become proof that even the most traumatic experiences could be transformed into sources of strength and purpose, and that one person's courage to speak truth to power could create ripple effects that changed everything. The girl, who had been stripped of her dignity in a Texas locker room, had become a woman who dedicated her life to ensuring that no other student would ever have to endure such humiliation in silence. That transformation, from victim to victor to advocate for countless others, was perhaps the most powerful revenge of all. More standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.